it hasn't gone through a reform process and it hasn't been incorporating this wave of concepts, they should incorporate them. And if they have already, the important thing here is to ensure that they get actually implemented. Second point here is accessibility to information. Here I just want to stress the point that the policies, strategies, regulations, and alike should be based on scientific data. And scientific data, it's coming and coming constantly. So the idea here is that one of adaptive planning, so that policies and regulations can be actually be revised and improved according to new information arriving. Public participation, this is also recognized as one of the key pillars of modern water legislation. It's one of the topics that you all have mentioned within your recollection of issues that have been discussed within your government, so to say. But it raises a full series of questions. For example, who are the stakeholders that should be involved, or in what type of decisions, in which ones are we going to include them, or what type of information should be provided, and how can it be effectively achieved? How much consideration should be given in the decision making to the views of the stakeholders? So all of these questions are questions that have to find an answer also in national legislations. Another point about the national legal frameworks is the ones of rights and responsibilities. Here I just want to cross through the message that rights and duties should be well defined for all types of users. For example, in the topic of groundwater, it should be quite clear what type of procedures exist to get permissions and to get access for extractions. So all of this has to be specified in specific laws or regulations. Another topic, level of decentralization. So up to what level are you going to decentralize your water resource management agencies? Talking a little bit about the institutional frameworks. Or, for example, if you're going to promote the creation of water user associations at the sub-basin and micro-basin level. So all these are different tools that should be considered within national frameworks. Finally, it's important for laws to provide for compliance and enforcement mechanisms at the same time that it makes sure that there is in place some mechanisms for settlement of disputes. And that, in a nutshell, I'm sure that we can stay here for a long time, but that in a nutshell are just selected elements that national frameworks should be looking at. As I said, here the objective would be to assure that they are included already in the national legislations. And if so, then the next step is that they actually get implemented. Now, talking about shared waters, so that would be the other side of the coin, so to say. I think it's important to say that the utilization and protection of international water courses, it's also one of the major focus of law, or of international law. Basically through the development and through the implementation of the rule of equitable and reasonable utilization, which is a means of reconciling conflicting interests and balancing relevant factors. There's also the topic of procedural rules, for example, for exchange of data and information, which should be implemented along with public participation, even if it's at a transboundary level. Finally, regarding shared waters, or talking about shared waters, the topic of joint commissions, it's also a very key aspect because it plays an outstanding role in coordinating the implementation of IWRM across the shared river basin. So this is just, I was not sure what type of audience we were going to have today in the floor, so I just wanted to give like a small picture of how the two levels, so to say, are linked together, and what would be the traditional sources of each of them. As you can see in the international law, we have principles, but we also have customary law, we have framework conventions, which there can be delivered, no, they can be specified even better in what they are basin agreements, and this gets also explained further, and it grows and develops through international jurisprudence. Whereas at the national law level, we have constitutions, we have environmental acts, we have water acts, and as we have talked before, some other acts that are also relevant for IWRM implementation, for example, the Forestry Act. Talking about principles specifically, I also don't want to touch upon all the principles. I just want to touch upon 3 of them very quickly. I'm going to focus on the cooperation principle, equitable and reasonable utilization, and duty not to cause harm. First of all, regarding cooperation, this principle basically means that sharing states should consult each other and negotiate of bona fide. This does not mean an obligation to avoid the creation of such risks. That means that in a country it's completely possible to have a project for implementing X or Y dam, for example. But what it does mean in concrete terms is an obligation of carrying out an environmental impact assessment, for example, and making sure that this information is shared with the other riparian. Okay, yeah. Regarding equitable and reasonable utilization, and duty not to cause sensible harm. Well, the point here is that there is also not sorry. Excuse me. Yeah. So I'm going to continue. How the principles are used. So basically the idea here that the principles of international water law can be used or can be served as a basic framework for international water diplomacy. Yeah, so they serve, or they have served already to develop agreements, so that's how they get concretized, but they also have served as the basis for settling disputes among riparians. But above all, it is important to clarify that their objective is to pursue mutual benefits for all the interesting parties, or all what they call the community of interest along the basin. Here, the next slide refers to who can actually make use of these principles. This is something that has been contested recently because traditionally they get implemented by states. Traditionally, international water law is only for the use of states. But we see, as we were discussing today in the morning with some colleagues, that this definition of international, national, local seems to be blurred. Seems to be some blurring boundaries. So even though it says that anyone can use this, maybe that's a little bit too confrontive. But the idea is that civil society can make use also in this of these principles to engage with their similars across the border, and with a view, obviously, of trying to equilibrate a little bit the playing field within upstream users and downstream users. So how do you formalize them, or how do you actually use them? I'm just gonna focus on the treaties and codes of conduct because they are two quite clear examples of what's a binding instrument and what's a non-binding instrument. A treaty, a perfect example would be the United Nations Water Courses Convention, also known as the UNWC or 1997 Convention. But we have several different types of examples. The SADC Protocol, for example, Lake Tanganyika, etc., etc. Whereas code of conducts, they are a little bit more rare. They could say that they are some type of species in development or something like this. But they are basically non-binding instruments agreed between different parties, be that civil society from one side of the border and the other one from the other side, or two persons or two companies, where they abide to regulate their conducts by a series of principles. And in the context of transboundary shared waters, that means of the principles of international water law. So, comparing just the two instruments, you have that the treaties obviously have what Alejandro mentioned before, right? They have this certainty that only law can give to such an instrument. But on the other hand, they have some challenges. For example, they are subject to political will, or they are also subject to a long process of negotiation that someone might argue that ecosystems might not be ready to wait for. And on the other side of the street, you could argue that you have the codes of conduct, which lack this legal certainty. They lack this bindingness. But on the other side, they represent an alternative way of governance. They are simple in their adoption. They can be negotiated here within the representations of Aquinonia Confundencia, for example, where you can reach some type of agreements in an agile and flexible way, and then two parties or two communities or two groups of water user associations can convene to abide their conducts by a series of principles. So in that sense, they are quite agile, and those principles can be changing flexibly, or at least the agreements that are taken within codes of conduct or within joint bodies created by codes of conduct can be changed agilely and flexibility. So some conclusions from the international perspective. So law has a lot to offer, especially because it has this underlying idea of helping a downstream country even the playing field for the negotiations. But also it's important that it provides a basis for settling disputes and a basis for actions and agreements. But also from the perspective of national legislation, it is important to establish a good environment to determine different tools that are going to help implementation of water management and development within the country. So in that sense, it's important to seek the implementation and the enforcement of national legal frameworks. Thank you very much. So then I think I would give the... Is there any question or any comments? Please.
I would make one brief comment. And it's just that in looking at the sources, the formal sources of international water law, I think it's important always to mention customary international law. Because I think there is a danger that people may assume that in the absence of an agreement, or where one party, one riparian state, chooses not to join a conventional regime, that state, and many states, I think, mistakenly believe this themselves, that they are under no obligations because they have not signed the proposed regional or basin agreement. In the vast majority of cases, that state is still bound by very, very similar sets of rules and requirements. We have recently had the International Court of Justice, for example, state that transboundary environmental impact assessment was a binding requirement of customary international law. That rule was considered, in 1997, when the final text of the UN Convention was drafted, it was not thought that that was yet customary law, so it was not included in the convention. 13 years later, the court was able to confirm that now it is. It has arrived, it has crystallized as a rule. So customary law will often be even more developed than conventional regimes. And in practice, most conventional regimes really seek to codify, clarify, and tidy up the customary situation. So I would just, as a way of proceeding, I would always try and mention custom, for fear the ideal would develop that states are not bound by a comprehensive suite of rules when they do not accede to a convention or where a convention does not exist. That's just a comment.
Oh, do you mind presenting yourself for those ones that don't know you?
Sorry, my name is Owen McIntyre. I teach environmental law at University College Cork, part of the National University of Ireland, and I have a research interest in international water law quite well.
And you also sit on the regional ministerial commission between Catalonia and Commonwealth.
Exactly. So that's one of the advantages of having such an expert with us on the room. Is there any other comment or reaction for the time being? So then, if not, then I would suggest if we can proceed to put the questions again back in the room. Yes. Very good. So then I would like to invite then the representatives of Aquinonia and Confundesia, if you can reconvene and now proceed to answer the questions 4 to 7, if possible.
4 to 6.
4 to 6. Entonces, so how do we continue?
Same way we started.
Okay.
Well, the we have the representative from the royal family, so she will guide us what to do with this. There was more soft than it was presuming. It was more aggressive in a sense. That's what we did here. So the Queen with a group of experts proposing to meet.
One thing might be, because I think you raised a question earlier on about what at the national level also what legal framework, what policy law and institutions do this. So the government structure. That's one of those important areas.
What issues in the
Yeah, essentially.
ministry, department, under national law? Who is running the water issues of this country?
We have created something that is called the Commission for National Water Management.
This is under which ministry?
It has quasi-ministerial, quasi, it has a quasi-ministerial legal. So speaking of there, it has a board called the basin board. So that it has to provide in this according to the basin. And then when it's a big basin, you have sub-basins nested.
Going down to
Exactly. It goes down into a pyramid of micro water
in the little villages.
Yes, that goes up the way.
And under which law they are operating?
It was a reform of last year. That's a problem. That so far just one committee has been actually created, right? And it's also supposed that the committee is up to the lowest. And so far, that's really so you have to look at you have to.
But for the other sector, okay, so let's say for the moment, the main institution for the water is the water basin committee of the report.
Yes.
That's one. But for the other sector,
Under it there is a big lake.
Yes. Which that might be level.
So this is the first action to be taken.
You think what do you think is the case? That at the local level there's not so many microwave needs and people are not organizing themselves. Or authorities are not organizing. You know what I mean?
I understand what you mean, but again, if you want to manage resource, you need someone in the top that regulates under him everyone, and he has the right to enforce the regulations.
Yeah. But how do you enforce focus for even if it's included within your law? You can't enforce it. You can't